Hello, and welcome to the Curious Culture. In each episode, I talk to incredible people about their fascinating curiosity. I am your obsessively curious host, Nick Haralambis. And in this episode, Rob Mcginnis and I talk about the pulling of CO2 from the atmosphere and turning it into fuel, as well as theater and storytelling and much more. Rob Mcginnis, PhD, is founder and CEO at Prometheus, a Silicon Valley startup that removes CO2 from the air and turns it into zero net carbon gasoline and jet fuel that are price competitive with fossil fuels. Previously, he founded Mattershift, which uses the first scalable carbon nanotube membrane to develop fertilizer, chemicals, and medicines from molecular building blocks, and Oasis Water, which reduced the energy and cost of desalination by more than 50%. Rob has made numerous key innovations in the field of nanotechnology, energy, separation, desalination, and water purification. He invented the first direct air capture CO2 to fuels process that can produce drop-in replacements for fossil fuels at a competitive price. He invented the first practical and scalable carbon nanotube membrane, as well as the first hollow fiber carbon nanotube membrane. As an undergraduate, he invented the NH3CO2 FO process he commercialized at Oasis, and co-invented the first thin film composite polyamide FO membrane, which achieved greater than 2 times increases in performance over previous FO membranes. If you don't even know what an FO membrane is, that's completely okay. Rob is here to explain it to us. If, like me, you struggle with science in school, then never fear. In this episode, Rob turns the complex into the simple. Rob, thank you so much for joining me today. We both agree it is an absolutely insane time in the world, but let's kick off by you telling us a bit about what you do at Prometheus.
Yeah, so I'm Rob Mcginnis. I founded Prometheus Fuels, and what we do is we remove carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into gasoline and jet fuel. That we use electricity from solar and wind to do that. So when you burn those fuels, they don't emit new carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And we do that because it's the fastest way to decarbonize transportation, which is responsible for up to about 10 gigatons of CO2 per year if you were to replace all oil. That's what we do.
The parts that I love so much about what you've just explained is how matter-of-factly you explain those things, and and that you use the turn of phrase 10 gigatons. Can you put that into normal person quantified numbers?
The most useful way to state it is that right now we emit about 40 gigatons of CO2 per year to the atmosphere that isn't already there.
Wow.
Essentially taking it from under the ground and putting it into the air, and that is creating an envelope of warming that is destabilizing our climate and threatens to make the Earth uninhabitable. So yeah, we want to not do that anymore. And 10 gigatons is about a quarter of the problem. If we want to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, which is actually a quite serious degree of warming, we need to remove about 20 gigatons per year pretty quickly. So to replace oil and to remove 10 gigatons is quite meaningful. It's a quarter of total emissions and half of what we need to do quickly.
Great, thank you. That was super useful. So the listeners of my podcast are quite used to my first question. So I'm going to dive right in and ask you if you were a curious child.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that most of the people you talk to would say yes also. The kind of curious I was probably pretty annoying to the people around me, if I remember correctly, because I was big and big on questioning assumptions. And so I always wanted to know why. So when you're a 4-year-old, that just means you ask why over and over again, no matter what is said. And that's really annoying. And then as I started to become a teenager, then it's like, why are these rules the way they are? And I sort of had trouble wanting to follow rules that I didn't understand. And so that's probably not uncommon. But my curiosity ended up funneling into kind of 2 main areas. You go through a period of time where you're curious about everything, but then after a while you find that there's some things that just really drive you, and these ended up being 2 things which are pretty different. And one of them is sort of how and why the world works the way it does, so physics, metaphysics, and philosophy. And the other one was sort of why are people the way they are. And those are related. Some people would relate them tightly, but I would say that they're pretty different in practice. And so what ended up happening is I ended up being really into science and engineering, and also really into theater and playwriting and storytelling and narrative. And those 2 through lines have kind of been the places where my creativity and my curiosity, these are closely linked. We talk about how you think or how I think that they're like linked. But my curiosity tends to drive my motivation, right? And those are the places where the curiosity has driven me the most, is those two parallel tracks, and they actually come together. And I'd love to apply fate to my life, but it's probably just accident. But they come together in an entrepreneur's life, right? So a tech entrepreneur has to have a deep knowledge and facility with science and technology, but they also have to be able to create products and a brand and a culture, a human culture in which people live and work, when they're a part of the company. And those can be really different activities. But it just so happens that the two things that I've just been really, really curious about are both super useful as an entrepreneur.
That was so incredibly fortuitous that you got the theater side that like explodes this imagination in your brain, and then the science and physics. And I think you're right. So few entrepreneurs recognize that both sides of those things are relatively imperative, especially in the tech space. Like, it's a creative thing to build a business. It's not just grind.
That's right. Yeah, and you have to be able to tell a really good story. I find that as a founder, storytelling has been almost my number one job. I have to tell my employees a story about where we're going and why. I have to tell investors the same, but also why that's going to be doing well and doing good. Why it can 10x, 100x, and also solve a problem someone cares about, and not just be some little widget, that doesn't matter. And, you have to tell stories to customers. You have to tell stories to partners and vendors. If you have a really good story to tell, a really great mission, and a really good reason why you can satisfy that mission, it just knocks down barriers in every direction. All of a sudden, your suppliers can get you that thing you need faster, and like amazing people you would never think would join an early stage startup are like, sign me up. I'll give up, 9/10 of my pay. And it all comes down to something worth doing, right? Which is fundamentally a story.
Absolutely agree. I spent my university career studying journalism and philosophy, and I could never really figure out how those gelled with my entrepreneurial drive from when I was 16. And only when I got a little bit older did I realize that investors don't really invest in numbers very often. They most likely invest in an entrepreneur who can tell a good story.
That's right. And it's a special kind of story, right? It's not just one around a campfire that makes your heart,
Yeah.
swell. It's one where you say the world is like this, and we need to change this part of it, and then the world will be like this after that. And it has to be rooted in evidence, and you have to be able to show a demo, right? Demo or die. And it's got to be a mix of the imagined and the real, because a tech startup is always a piece of the future, right? It's not as real as it will be, and so you're always in this sort of future looking kind of storytelling way, but it has to be rooted in something tangible. It has to be more than just hope.
That phrase you use, demo or die, that reminds me or strikes me of a very Y Combinator kind of phrase.
Yeah, that's actually the MIT Media Lab. MIT Media Lab came up with that one, but I think that the startup community has phrased it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and you guys participated in Y Combinator, if I'm not mistaken.
We did.
I'm curious about their focus on the storytelling aspect versus the numbers and the building aspect.
Yeah, I mean, Y Combinator is almost like a boot camp kind of education. It's like a little bit of university, a little bit of boot camp. It's like where my perception is that they're mainly transmitting a culture, a mindset, a perspective. And, it seems obvious to people who have been successful entrepreneurs that would be a way to see the world. But a great many people do not see the world through the lens of Y Combinator. And it's a practical thing. But I'd say the thing that they probably end up doing the most around demo day is helping you to simplify what you're trying to say. So there's this tremendous reduction process. It's like, that's all cool, but if you were to say that in one phrase, And so one of the first things they make you do is they make you describe your company in one simple, easy to understand but very compelling phrase. We do this. And so, but yeah, demo or die is part of their culture. There's a lot of people that came out of MIT in the background there, also Yale, like I did, Stanford, and those universities are also in part transmitting culture through generations. So Y Combinator has really got that figured out. They're really great.
Yeah. Since you mentioned those tertiary education institutions that globally are well recognized, one of the questions I was going to ask you a bit later on that I think I'll ask now is, lots of people feel like tertiary education institutions just funnel you down a specific route that you've already chosen. They don't really promote or spike your curiosity. And the the story that comes to mind is Steve Jobs just attending random classes without signing up to any of them because he was curious and he didn't want to be stuck to a specific curriculum. What's your view on tertiary education versus just exploring the world?
I would say the flip side of curiosity is that when I was a kid, for example, if I was being made to learn something by rote, all the emphasis was on homework. I hated it, didn't do it, was really bad at it, got terrible grades in it. And I think that's what Steve Jobs might have been thinking about, is that kind of structure. I also think that when you're at the higher levels of tertiary education, that it actually is more free. There's this idea that if you go to a sort of a not very good engineering school, and I wouldn't name anyone out that way, but let's say that you think it's not very good, it'll be because you spend all your time churning through the equations. You just do differential equations all day, and you're not solving any problems. You're not exploring creativity. But the best classes at the best schools are very much open-ended, curiosity-driven activities, but with a purpose, like robot wars. Like I was a graduate assistant in a robot wars class where you have to essentially build and program a robot, and they either fight each other or they are on a racetrack or something. But you can solve the problem any way you want. And they give you examples of previous successes, and you have to figure it out. Or other classes I helped to teach, where you would make a chair out of cardboard, and then as the grad student, I had to be able to sit in it without having it collapse, and I'm pretty heavy, so I had to really solve the problem. They could do it however they wanted, or concrete boats or whatever. There's lots of engineering courses that engage creativity because there's really nothing like having a problem you care about solving to drive curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. So jumping back a little bit to when you were younger, teenagers maybe, was there anyone in your life that sparked a deeper curiosity and led you down the path that you're on now that you can kind of single out in your memory?
I would say my mom and I were really close insofar as we just, if we were in the same room, we were talking about things, and it usually was trying to figure something out, trying to explore some idea. My dad would be in the boundaries, why so much talking. So I think that was probably the thing. Not everyone has that. Some people have a teacher or a friend or something like that. But for me, I think it was just the fact that my mom and I were constantly high bandwidth, trying to figure the world out together. So she was probably teaching me to do that.
Okay. So tell me about the role that curiosity played in the founding of Prometheus. I mean, was it iterative? Were you seeking out the specific thing? How did you end up building this business?
It started out absolutely with curiosity because this is my third startup. And my first one, I came up with a new way to desalinate seawater and cut the energy and the cost by half, and it was really cool. And raised a bunch of money and it commercialized. And when I left it, I wanted to do something that was really really hard. I wanted to show that I could solve super hard challenges. I felt like I'd done my kind of my debut thing, and now I wanted to do something double black diamond. So I decided to start trying to make a nanoscale separation device called a carbon nanotube membrane. And the reason that's important to this is because one of the things that I've always been most curious about is I went through kind of a mechanistic phase where I wanted to know how clockwork kind of things work, but then I wanted to go smaller. I started being obsessive in imagining what it's like at the level of atoms bumping into one another with Brownian motion. When you get down to the angstrom scale and you're talking about quantum mechanics meeting physics or thermodynamics, which are statistical probabilities, and all this sort of thing, like when you transfer from Boltzmann's constant to Planck's constant, so this is a deep dive, and I'm not going to try and explain all the things I'm saying, but
I appreciate that.
yeah. So the basic idea was that I started getting obsessed with Richard Feynman's molecular factories concept. This idea that you could somehow grab with little pinchers, like little tweezers, the size of atoms, and grab atoms and put them together in this really intentional way, like they were Lego blocks. What if you made things that way? And the problem of actually doing that in some practical sense, because if you're trying to manipulate things you can't see, you have to only imagine that for most of history have been described either through myth or through statistical probabilities, and then only recently through quantum mechanics, which is even just weirder, right? To be able to manipulate that nanoscale world in a way that has macro scale effects, I just couldn't let it go. And so I actually spent like 5 or 6 years in a lab by myself for the most part. I had an assistant for a while, but I just rented a private laboratory and kind of a couple hours outside of New York City, and just went mad scientist and figured out how to take 2.5 trillion nanotubes, about 1 nanometer in diameter, and make them all stand up in a line, like if you're holding a bundle of straws, right? In surrounded by polymer, so that you could make things go through it single file, like water or air would go through like single file atoms, and that was something you would never be able to do or want to do if you weren't intensely curious about it. So I was setting out to try and figure out how to use these in a true molecular factory. I had this like idea for how this membrane could be the platform. Imagine each one of those nanotubes being a conveyor belt, and you can actually put like nano electromechanical systems on the openings and things like that, right? And so, as you probably know, and as anyone listening to this can see, like this is not the kind of language that gets a startup funded. This is the kind of language that makes people back away slowly or drink more, right? So, but it turns out that having had that practical experience in the first startup company, I knew that I had to reduce all that kind of crazy dreamer talk down to one solid, practical, achievable, amazing thing. And the thing I knew that it could probably do the best, that would be the most interesting, would be to make fuel from the air, essentially, to print fuel out of thin air, the molecular factory.
You say that very matter of factly. When you say the thing you knew it could do the best, how did you know it could do that the best?
You just put the pieces together. I mean, I thought for a long time, and this is definitely like sort of like directed curiosity or imagination, right? Where what can you do with this? And I would just go through this long laundry. This must have been like 6 months where like every day I was just thinking like, what can this do? I could do that. I could do this. No, we need this thing. I could do this, but it'd have to be at like 5 degrees Kelvin. So you're just going to end up coming up with something that is practical. And I'd say for probably the most interesting thing I could think of to do is to actually print fuel from the air, and then later you turn the air into materials, and you could actually make medicines, and you're back to that molecular factory. And I was like, no, reduce, just fuel. And it sort of in 2018 is when it seems like most of the people in the United States woke up to climate change in a way they hadn't before. And at the end of that year, there was a request for startups from Y Combinator for carbon removal technologies. And so I just recognized that as a really important timing indicator, because a startup lives or dies on its timing.
Absolutely.
And so if you're off by 6 months, you're screwed. So I took that as the reason to make the big bet. I dropped everything else and I started Prometheus, and I applied to Y Combinator and got in, which in itself is an amazing thing. They take a lot of people, but it's like a fraction of a percent of the people who apply. And part, I think they like the fact that matter of fact, they described solving this amazing problem with the solution that people just weren't talking about. Really, it was something that they hadn't really heard much about, and they like ambition. They like ridiculous ambition. So, and that brought me to taking all the molecular factory concepts down to this one thing, which essentially is a machine that takes air and turns it into fuel. And so you have 3 months in the YC batch, and they give you $150,000. And I spent that 3 months and all that money building that machine, essentially. And just like the previous 6 years, I pretty much built it by myself. I brought in some help, but for the most part, just from the ground up. Home Depot parts, 80-20 strut, which is, for those who don't know it, it's like an aluminum, kind of like a rector set for engineers, and built it. And it finished it the night before Alumni Day, which is the day before Demo Day.
That's so amazing. So I'm curious, I read up that you have about 20 patents to your name. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so I've met people that have hundreds, and they tend to have worked at big companies that just really spend a lot of money on patents. Patents can be extremely expensive to process, and I filed a lot of them when I was in grad school and at Oasis Water, my first company. But then when I was in this sort of super lean phase where I had very little funding and I was just working alone, I became much more careful. So instead of filing a lot of patents, I would file one that was really critical. So I wouldn't brag about having 20-something patents. I mean, I know a lot of people that have just way more patents. You just can't win that fight.
Yeah. So what I'm curious about is one of the patents, the methodology that you apply to pluck the CO2 out of the air, and can that then be applied to a variety of other things that you can license out to other industries to solve other problems?
Yes, I'd say, but I filed a pretty broad patent for essentially air to fuels. using a new approach with this molecular factory kind of concept in mind. And I filed it around the same time that I formed the company, and it actually granted and published like October. Granted in like October and published just in March. So it was extremely fast, and that one was really broad. So that's the main one. You know, if I'd been in a big organization, that would have been spread out over years, and it would have been like, you know, another 20, right?
Yeah.
But this is just one.
So shifting the conversation now to that word that I loathe, innovation. In your experience, how do you think of innovation, and how would you define it and explain it in your world? And I'm especially interested in your perspective as a scientist here.
The definition of innovation depends on what culture you're in. If you're in academia, it tends to be trying to do something very novel and with a lot of attention grabbing characteristics, and then stopping and going and looking for the next thing that's like that. And I think people are a little bit against that because there's this valley of death between the university and the world where those amazing things never seem to cross. And then in business, innovation is just overused to the point of being meaningless. And you know, they'll apply it to, you know, a Gantt chart for that quarter's sales, and at that point, like, doesn't mean anything at all. But I would say for startups, it is still a term that's quite relevant to what we do. And in the context of curiosity, I would say that it flows this way. So you start out with something that you care about fixing, you know, some problem you want to solve, and then that passion for solving it leads you to be intensely curious about what it is, how it works. You want to dissect the problem, right? And figure out if you're, you know, so, you know, I know we're surrounded by the virus, you know, right now. And so you can imagine a scientist like looking at all the spikes and all the proteins and trying to essentially decompose that thing into its parts so they can see where to attack the problem, right? So it can be like that in software or in hardware also, you know, and so you're essentially trying to figure out where you can attack the problem, and that curiosity drives you to start trying things, a great many of which fail terribly, you know, and embarrassingly, you know. But then you just, if you've got the right environment in your startup or in your mind, those things don't bother you. You're like, oh, great, I don't have to try that one again. You know? And then that process of being passionate, followed by being curious, followed by putting in just a tremendous amount of work. And this is what you call the Edisonian phase, right? This is where he says you learn 10,000 things that don't work and 99% perspiration, all those phrases, right? It's true there. And then what's really interesting is this other phase of innovation where now you've got something that kind of works, and you're trying to see if you can productize it, bring it to the world, or if you can improve it or iterate it, and trying to decide when it becomes a product. When is it a minimum viable product, and when is it still something you're working on? And the hard thing about the curiosity innovation is that if you don't channel your efforts into something that you can launch, then you are tinkering. You're just ruminating, right? But if you launch, then, and this is why the demo is so important, because the demos are kind of a pre-launch, right? If you're not demoing, you're not reducing the problem. Because some startups will stay in the hangar for too long, using up all the resources, and they're, you know, what I think investors would call a science project, and that's no good. But other times you rush out with the solution, and then you find out you didn't really understand the problem, or you didn't really understand the ecosystem. And the thing about launching a product when you still have resources is that you very quickly get feedback on all the ways it sucks and what people like about it, and then you start iterating. And once you're at that point where you're getting real feedback on a thing you've actually launched, you've reduced it to the point where it does a thing in a clean way, that's an innovative phase that's the best, right? Because then you start actually making something get better, and then you're actually realizing that, you know, that motivation you had in the first place of solving the problem. And sometimes it takes unexpected turns, but each one of those steps is sort of a different phase, and you kind of have to have a different mindset when you're in it. It requires some discipline, but at the same time, you have to be able to sort of expand your consciousness. So it's like this expansion of imagination and curiosity, and this contraction to purpose and execution, and this expansion and this contraction that you have to do with your mind, and it's hard. And as a leader of a startup, you have to create an environment where everybody else can do that, even harder.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And so interesting your perspective on failure versus a lot of other startup founders that I've spoken with. And having also studied philosophy, it's interesting to see how your approaches to things like innovation, curiosity, and failure are a combination of philosophy and scientific. Science, like you've just said, the Edisonian perspective on things. And in philosophy, there aren't really rights and wrongs, there are iterations on those things. So, what I'm curious about is how does your experience of failure trickle into your business? Does your team also have the same approach, or are they quite hard on themselves? And how do you guys deal with failure?
The philosophy is a good point. I mean, I took a deep dive into philosophy as part of my trajectory, and a lot of things about philosophy. There's storytelling about solving problems, and the paradoxes are the ones that are maybe the most interesting to most people. The Zeno's paradox,
Yes.
right? Where you get the distance by half, and then you realize there's an infinite distance between you and your goal. Or the ship of Theseus,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where if you replace every plank in the ship, is it still the same ship? Those
Mm-hmm.
kind of mental exercises are really useful because you're sitting there in a crisis, because startups are like a roller coaster of crisis and victory, right? And so you're sitting
Yeah.
there and you're asking yourself, can I replace all the planks in this somehow and still have it be the same thing, or is that too much? And the people you choose to hire, especially the first like half dozen or so in a startup, their approach to all this becomes part of the company's identity, right? The
Yeah.
founder starts it, but it's ultimately created by the people who are in it. And the larger that group gets, then the more the founder's original contribution to the culture is diluted. And so I tend to look for people who are very creative, but who are willing to reduce, to do the contraction to, through purpose to launch also. And that's a hard thing to find. I've had people that I've had work with me that are extremely creative, extremely intelligent, but they just never want to let go of the expansion phase of the thinking. And I've met other people that are just amazingly practical in their execution, like someone who's just like a super talented mechanic, build anything, but you pretty much have to direct them the whole time because they're never kind of taking over with their own curiosity. And trying to find that person who can do both things, it's just that they're very rare, and everyone in Silicon Valley wants them. And, that's why people get paid seven-figure salaries to be engineers around here. But I find that if you offer them the right mission and show them what you've already built towards that and give them a free environment. By free, I mean a place where they can solve the problem however they want. It's a very, very specific problem. We are going to make fuel from air. We're not going to do anything else. We're going to make fuel from air, and we have to figure out how to do it. And this is what we've got already, and so we kind of want to use this or something like this and not some brand new thing. You don't want people coming in every day being, what if we made it out of rocks? What if we made it out of glass? It has to be like, no, we got this thing we made, and let's make this work or replace it. It can be a ship of Theseus. You can take everything we built and replace all of it with new things, but only if you are launching, not tinkering. And so I think I've done that at Prometheus. I think the people who are in Prometheus are free to solve the problem however they want. And there are always side projects, weird things going on, and that's not necessarily bad. Yeah. It's not like an official 20% rule like early Google, where a person can take every Friday and do whatever they want. But it is very much like unstructured. It's like it's small enough of a team. We're only 8 people now. It's small enough of a team where we can always talk about what we're doing informally, even though we're maybe spread out over the world. And that works. It gets harder when you get to that next phase where now you're like 50, 100 people. We're not there yet at Prometheus, and I've been there before, and I've got strategies I hope to use to do that. I mean, obviously, the closer you get to actually trying to push units out the door, then the more you need to kind of have people that are focused entirely on execution and people that are still in reserve in the skunk works. And then that can bifurcate culture, and all those things are hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting theme that is emerging in all of these interviews that I'm doing, and that is constraint. That some of the most curious, most innovative, and most interesting companies are actually built within very specific constraints, but underneath those constraints, complete freedom. And I think that is what you're describing is here is what we have to do. I trust that you're the best person to do this. Now go be free, my child, and build. And then you trust that they do their best work.
That's true. Although I'd say in the early days, you're really elbow to elbow solving it together. Okay. It's not quite the full delegation that would imply, where it's like you send somebody off to say, I want a data storage mechanism that I can communicate with in an encrypted way, go. It's more like, or I need a part that does this job, go find it. There is some of that. And whenever you give someone a purpose, you give them the freedom to change the change the criteria for success as well, as long as they communicate that back.
Yeah.
Because I find that one of the best solutions to problems is usually to reframe the problem.
Yeah.
And this is counterintuitive. A lot of people who want to control the work of people that they're delegating authority to, or asking to solve problems for them, they want to state the problem in a rigid way. But what some of my best hacks have been when I realized that I don't need to solve the problem I thought I had to solve, and I actually could do something totally different, or just like completely step around the obstacle and still get where I want to go. And you have to give people the ability to do that, but at the same time, if you just make it completely freeform, then you end up not with your fuel from error. You end up with, like, I don't know, the world's best toaster or something.
Yeah. So I want to drill down a little bit in the startup thing. I feel quite contentious about startups and the way that they're measured, and their success is measured around profit and not necessarily impact. I'm not sure if you've heard the phrase a zebra startup as opposed to a unicorn startup.
I have, yeah.
So that's the kind of the thing I'm picking on here. And curiosity is not necessarily the most efficient way to promote change or build something amazing. I mean, you said you took 5 or 6 years digging into this thing. It's kind of hard to justify to an investor that you're going to build 5 or 6 years with no return and hope for the best. So how do you balance that curiosity being inefficient but effective with startups needing to prove something quickly and get profitable?
Yeah, I think this constraint is why a lot of startups, for good or for bad, are going for small bets. They're
Yeah.
hoping to fill a niche. There's no judgment, on that. Sometimes solving a small problem and then growing that solution and applying it to many, many, many people can be a really valuable company, whether it gets acquired by a larger one or stands on its own. But a lot of times the problem that startups are trying to solve is not really very big, because there's just only so much you can ask an investor to tolerate in technical risk. As a matter of fact, most investors will not embrace technical risk at all.
Yeah.
It used to be, early days Silicon Valley, you hear stories that technical risks were a big part of it. But I mean, you're funding someone with the Nobel Prize who created a semiconductor. You get some leeway, right? So the more important the founder is, I guess, the more they can get away with. But if you're just like sort of starting out, you're out of college or grad school, and you want to solve a problem, it can be really daunting to try and solve a big problem. Usually, if you want to solve a big problem, what they end up doing is they end up kind of keeping that as sort of secret reserve, and they say, I'm going to solve this small problem. And then when they talk to investors, they expand that narrative and say, well, after we solve this problem and we launch it and we make this much money, we take that tech and you see how it turns into this, and that's huge. And then that's a really good way to do it. But you have to solve that narrative challenge and also that sort of progression for the future of the company. Like, because whatever your company starts making money doing, that becomes its fate. Your customers dictate your company's purpose. And if you start selling widgets for one thing and you plan on sort of just wresting the company's direction from that to something else, that's going to be really hard to do. But if you come up with a way where that first thing you do organically grows into a product development pipeline that turns into the big thing, then you've got it solved. When you're trying to start a company, you're trying to solve, like three-dimensional chess, right? You're trying to solve the early, you're trying to solve the later and huge, you're trying to solve how much money you need. The less money you need, the better off you are, right? I mean, we tend to think of startup companies as being inexpensive, but they're actually not, because the engineers are very hard to get, and you have to pay a lot. And so, you think it's just a person with a laptop, but there's a lot of competition for that person. And these things are always evolving, and the ecosystem for startups is always evolving. So I was sort of lucky in that I did this passion project to come up with this multi-purpose, foundational molecular factory, and then I ended up being able to port that over into this really, really hard challenge. And so that I guess put me in a good position.
Yeah, I mean, it is such a brilliant and wise insight into the world of startups for any young entrepreneurs or first timers, that you don't have to boil the ocean with startup number one. You have to pick a small problem. I'm certain that it was Paul Graham who said this: build something small to build something big. And it's okay to start with something small. And when you're 20, you think you need to rule the world, when actually you just need to rule your town, and then you can slowly expand from there. I've never thought of it as startup one can be a small problem, startup two can lead into something bigger, and now you're on startup three trying to pull CO2 out of the air and turn it into fuel. You just have to have the patience, I suppose, to wait for that to be the case.
Well, I mean, it's possible to have your first and only startup turn into something amazing, right? Like
Yes.
like growing Amazon from something that everyone in the business
Amazon,
world
yeah.
is. Yeah, they're like, oh, that's so stupid. Oh my god. And then you're like all your desks are doors, and no one has any money, and you're working like long hours, and then you slowly build it into like this behemoth, and everybody's like, oh, what's happened with that? I think it's amazing. That's one
Yeah.
strategy. But the other thing I would say is that anything we're talking about, there's a polygram essay on it. That's really the word. But
That is too true.
but if you were to put a caveat on that, start small, is that be careful what you work on, because it might succeed and you might be trapped in it. And what I mean is I'll use a quote from theater, from the sort of the other part of my life, which is storytelling. The playwright who wrote Orange is the New Black, she told the story about how she had a friend who was writing a show where they ended up having to like do all their film shoots in Paris and all their exotic locations, and everyone got to wear really sharp suits, and she wrote a story about women in prison, and so everyone wore orange, and it's always in prison. She's like, if you're going to write a story, you don't always want to. You want to make sure you don't write yourself into prison. You write yourself into Paris if you have a choice. So the idea is that if you decide you're going to make a small bet because that's achievable, and then that thing turns into a multi-billion-dollar company, and now you're getting older, you're going through the arc of your life script, and maybe you're having kids, and are you going to leave and start something else that's even harder? Maybe, but probably the gravitational pull is to stay in that thing you did. And if all you did was come up with a scalable way to make stickers for people, and apologies to anyone who has a business that does that, it's a great business. And that wasn't what you were really passionate about, then you screwed yourself with success. So you want to make sure that the problem you're trying to solve really matters to you, because you're going to suffer tremendously no matter what.
Yeah.
The suffering is intense. The self-doubt and all the people in your life telling you, like, oh, why don't you do something normal? Because a lot of an entrepreneur's life looks like failure for a very long time.
Yep. I think it was Jim Carrey who said, you can fail at something you don't like, so you may as well try something you do like.
That's another good one. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's just so well said. So one of the things that I love about curious people is their obsession with learning. And there is this great trend that is kicking in the world around lifelong learning. I'm sure it was similar when you left university. When I left university, it was like, here's your degree. Thank you very much. Go get a job and we'll see you never. And
right.
The advent of the internet and mobile phones and Wikipedia means that everyone can learn anything all the time. Do you set out specific time to learn stuff in your personal life, or is it just this constant learning that you do?
Constant learning, but I would say that everybody learns differently, within some pretty broad categories. I'm lucky because I can just pick up a textbook and I can kind of use that as a platform. So I think people call that like autodidact, right? Self-teaching.
Yes.
Other people really need an interactive sort of apprenticeship kind of style, where somebody who understands something they want to know guides them through it. That's not really my thing. And so I've always just had textbooks in fields I was curious about whenever I thought I was going to have time to read. So they're often in the restroom, or just sort of in the living room, and I just sort of like read them like 5 or 6 pages at a time. But over the course of the year, I'll go through a couple of them, and I tend to have pretty good understanding and retention of them. I've been pretty fortunate with that, because I went and built all the foundational mathematics and physics and chemistry and stuff. And my curiosity tends to be like, I'm reading a book now called Mass, about this really phenomenal British science writer, and that just sort of talks about the history of the Higgs field and things like this. The sort of what mass is, and maybe mass isn't like what we thought it was, and the history of sort of the development of quantum mechanics. Just as Einstein is ascendant, then all these new people come along with this crazy, spooky action and distance stuff, and the fact that everything in the world is Schrödinger's cat. And so these are the things that are on the sidelines that I'm always kind of, because a lot of what you're doing in a startup is administrative and practical, and you want to give yourself a free range to roam somewhere else. You don't want 100% of your life to be air to fuel, even though it's the coolest thing. You want to be able to daydream about quarks and bosons.
Do you carve out time to daydream, or is it just kind of whenever you do? Do you work when you're inspired to, and then daydream when you're inspired to do that?
Okay, yeah. So I would say that my approach is to unstructure my life as much as possible. So so I don't approach it with a rigid schedule. I don't say, all right, emails from this time to this time, meetings from this time to this time. I try to delegate activities as soon as I can. I try to simplify. everything everyone's doing. And one of the characteristics, of the companies I've tried to start is that I don't ever ask anyone to do busy work. If there's nothing to do, we leave. There's always something to do, but I mean, you're never making it up. You're never punching a clock, and so I apply that to myself too. And I find that the interstitial moments sometimes are the places where you unexpectedly really want to have that mental exploration. So I don't carve out a time. I kind of try and carve out all time. And I do what I need to do when it needs to be done and try and leave the rest of it be white space. It can be hard because a startup is just very demanding. There's a lot to do in a very small number of people. I try to leave most of my day uncommitted. It ends up becoming consumed by work anyway. And I don't know if that style scales to 5,000 employees, but I think what you have to do as an entrepreneur is you have to constantly be changing your approach to what you do. The founder CEO job changes the fastest. What you need to be in the first 6 months or a year is not who you need to be the second year and not how you need to be the third year. So I might find that if I were to talk to you in 2 years that I'm all about the regimen. But right now it's not the case.
Let's schedule that in, and in 2 years I'll ping you.
Okay.
So the final question is related to the global pandemic that we're all experiencing, but I am in no way a medical intelligent person and my focus is on business. So I'm curious, as the CEO and founder of a new startup doing this incredible world-changing technological advancement, how does something like this pandemic affect your strategy in the long term? Does it change anything you're trying to do in any way, and how do you see it affecting startups?
Well, the long term has not been changed by coronavirus for us because climate change is still looming. I've heard some people talking about coronavirus is like the dress rehearsal and climate change is the play. It's like they're both really hard, but climate change is just enormous. I mean, it's existential, right? We're fighting now to save hundreds of thousands or millions of lives, in each country, and that is worth doing and focusing on completely. But climate change, if we don't also solve that, we're talking about much greater loss of life, right? So we have to really just have to do both. If my startup had been Tinder for Cats or something, then I would say that I have no idea how it's going to apply to the world after this because the world is restructuring fundamentally in a lot of ways, especially socially.
Yeah.
But because we're solving climate change, offering a commodity that really everybody has to use, right? I mean, gasoline, jet fuel, this is a $2 trillion commodity market. It's so ingrained into every economy in the world that, it's hard to imagine something other than food that reaches as deeply everywhere. So I think that because we chose a fundamental problem to solve that is unchanged by momentary crises, that it doesn't actually change our approach really at all, other than the fact that it also happened to correspond with an oil war and an oil price war. And so what that means is that price war is much different than war. But oil price war, we have to just drive our price lower and lower and lower. We are going to compete with fossil fuel on price. Should have said that at the beginning. It's critical because making fuel is one thing, but making it at the right price is everything.
Absolutely.
But in the short term, we actually took some of our equipment and repurposed it to make personal protective equipment for medical workers. So in the short term, we're making face shields. We have a water jet cutter, which is enormous. It has like a 5 foot by 10 foot platform, and we can rapidly cut through inches of material, whether it be steel or plastic. So that thing can cut, in theory, 10,000 face shields a day. We can't assemble that many because there's so few of us, but we're keeping the pace on our primary objective, which is solving climate crisis. But in our interstitial moments where we might have been taking a break or having a sandwich, we're cutting face shields instead. And a lot of people are doing things like that. And I would say that a year from now or 2 years from now, the world will have restructured, but it's still going to use fuel, and we're still going to be plummeting towards climate catastrophe. My goal is that by the time the world kind of comes out of this, we have a solution for a huge part of that ready.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Rob, this was absolutely fascinating. And my last statement is always to offer my guests the opportunity to tell my listeners where they can find you, what you want to promote. If there's any way they can follow you, just let them know. If there is nothing, then thank you so much for having your time with me.
Our website is prometheusfuels.com, and we also have an Instagram. So there are a lot of behind the scenes photos of us cutting and building things and lighting fuel on fire and things that we'd love people to come see. Depending on when this goes out, we may or may not still be usefully contributing to face shields. If people need them, to contact us, and we'll try and make them for them.
Amazing. It will definitely go out in the next month or two, so that will be relevant. Rob, thank you so much for your time, and I will let you get back to your day.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Curious Cult podcast, the show where we talk to incredible people about their fascinating curiosity. If you like this episode, please rate the show, like it, share it, and generally be kind to us and tell people about it. My goal is to spark curiosity that changes the world. And you can help by talking about the show to anyone who will listen. Stay curious. Until next time.